I'm now joined by Obianuju Ekeocha. She is the author of a terrific book called Target Africa, which I have on my desk and which is covered in dog ears and filled with ink by me. But the original ink is brilliant, and I highly recommend the book, and I'm honored to have the author with me. Good to see you, Obianuju Ekeocha. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me, and I'm really excited to be on your shows. This is great for me. Thank you.
You've been busy. I see you every time I get online, you're in a different country or a different state, and you're spreading the message. Your message is a powerful one. As the subtitle indicates, tell our viewers a little bit, if you would, Uju, about the idea of ideological neocolonialism in Africa. What is that?
Right. So this is a term that I think most people know of, but they don't, they just don't have a term or a word for it. But the actual phenomenon has been happening for a couple of decades now. People have seen it, people have witnessed it, people kind of know it, but they just don't have a name. So that's why we've pinned a name to it in the book, Ideological Neocolonialism. It's found within the relationships between African nations and their Western donors, the Western countries that give them foreign aid, the organizations that come into Africa as donors, and even like the agencies and foundations, like, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So within that give and take relationship, that recipient and donor relationship, we then are finding more and more increasingly that the donors who are powerful, who are usually Western and who are usually wealthy, they come with their own ideas, with their own ideals, with their own ideologies, and they are trying to impose it. It's kind of a gentle imposition upon the African people to corrode or erode our own cultural views and values, especially when it comes to sexual morality, issues that have to do with marriage or the sanctity of life or the way the Africans understand human sexuality. So ideological neocolonialism in a way just describes that there is there's a colonialism going on. They're trying to kind of annex the Africans to take us into their own way of thinking. And I must say here, in full disclosure, I didn't coin the term. Most recently, the term was kind of popularized by Pope Francis, who mentioned it during his address at the United Nations in 2015, as well as some other places where he was, especially when he would go to a third world country, just saying that these people don't want these values, but the wealthy donors come from the West and they come with these values and these visions and these definitions of the world, and they're trying to impose it upon us.
Right. One aspect that many people miss is a very raw, simple aspect that any populist in the age of Trump should be able to understand,
right,
which is that cultural Marxism and the tenets of radical feminism, of sexual ideology, of the LGBT movement, and of family planning ideology and abortion, all of those things are just plain unpopular in much of Africa, as they once were in the U.S. And in the U.S., it took a lot of campaigning and propaganda to increase the approval ratings for these horrible things. But in Africa, we're almost getting a snapshot of something earlier, where these people are, as recently as Pew polled in the area in 2014, totally against, for instance, abortion. And yet it's being aggressively shoved down their throats. What about that?
Yeah, exactly. So it's so rare that you find pollsters coming in to see how the Africans see things, to take up our views or our values, to know exactly what do we want, what do we care about, what are the things that are important to us. But every time they poll us, it's very impressive to find that sometimes as much as 80% of the population would say that they find abortion reprehensible, they find abortion completely unacceptable. Something like the homosexual lifestyle, whenever they poll, it's always in the 90 percentile of populations within African nations saying we will never accept this kind of lifestyle, no matter what, as a normal part of society. So they have stopped polling, or so they don't like to poll us, because whenever it happens, you find all of that as well. But in addition to these kinds of, let's say, evidence-based, I will even say anecdotally, that what I find, or what I have found just growing up in Africa, being born in Africa, being raised in Africa, I went to university in Africa, I grew into adulthood in Africa, these kinds of things, these, let's call them the elements of the sexual revolution as it has been in the West, are completely rejected and abhorred by most people within African countries.
Yeah, it reminds me of a recent episode I did that commented on gay marriage, made it onto Right Wing Watch and also also Secular Talk, which is a leftist, atheistic, anti-Christian podcast.
Right.
And this guy made fun of me because I mentioned populism, and I mentioned the idea of there is some danger to letting the people, quote unquote, decide, right? Because demagogues love pure democracy, and that's how you establish tyrannies. In fact, is by saying, "Oh, it's up to the people," and then you give the people candy, and you make them say what you want them to say.
That's right.
But it's funny to me because, and he was saying, look at this elitist guy who's saying, don't listen to the people on gay marriage. But in fact, I was like, what are you talking about? Your entire project has been rejecting what the majority of people think. Secularism and secular leftism required a century-long, aggressive, disdainful, and destructive push against ordinary people in the U.S.
Well, precisely. They say that, and then yet they come to Africa and they completely ignore what the people say. And I totally agree with you. There is a danger to mobocracy, if you like, where you say let the people decide. But for the Africans, this is more rooted in the culture. This is more rooted from our cultural heritage. We didn't just become against abortion. We didn't just realize how horrible abortion is. These things are very intricately tied to our own cultural views, our own cultural values. For example, a lot of the African cultures and customs believe in the bloodlines, preserving the names and the bloodlines of our ancestors before us and the generations coming after us. So a pregnant woman, for example, is not only just seen as a pregnant woman, but she is carrying the name of her family forward. She's carrying the life of, the bloodlines of her ancestors forward to make sure that, that bloodline continues to persist.
Right.
So we believe in those kinds of things, and there is no way that a culture that believes so strongly in where we have come from in terms of our heritage and in terms of our, family genealogy and where we're heading to, there is no way that culture can coexist with something like abortion. Because for you to be able to turn around and abort a baby in the womb, that means you're going to have to completely either silence this other part where, my grandmother told me what her grandmother told her is that, we are carrying the precious bloodlines of the ancestors who have lived and worked hard before us. So that's how it is. And that's why sometimes, for example, if I digress a little bit, that I feel a little bit sorry, quite sorry actually for the African American populations, because we in Africa believe that they carry our bloodlines. They are the Americans who have within them the bloodlines. It doesn't matter how many hundreds of years ago, but they are carrying the bloodlines of tribes, of ancient tribes in Africa that still exist. And yet they are the ones who are having the most abortions. They are the ones who are more affected by the kind of attack that Planned Parenthood is having in minority communities. So we see it now as African bloodlines are being completely killed off within abortionist clinics. So that's that's the story there. And yeah, exactly.
Well, it's funny, and actually also African America, interestingly, a lot like Latino America, for some reason, at the same time as being, according to polling, actually, they've resisted a lot of progressivism in their personal lives. Yes. And yet they bear the brunt of the kind of cultural decay that progressivism propels.
That's right.
And so it's interesting. True. I mean, I wonder if there'll be, I don't know if you've heard of Candace Owens and Kanye West and that whole hubbub in the U.S., but Candace Owens, if nothing else, is strongly pro-life. And it would be cool to see a cultural shift where you have that. It would be cool to see that, like you said, for people to rise and forget Wakanda. You don't have to invent an artificial African nation.
Exactly.
What did you think of that, Wakanda, and the whole talk of African pride in
Yeah, but the African pride does exist too today. It exists within African communities.
I thought it only existed in the Marvel universe.
No, but seriously, I went and watched that movie, Black Panther. I totally enjoyed it. But people think or reduce Africans just to the beautiful clothes we wear or the colorful clothes we wear or our colorful art or, our food and the way we dance and our drums and all of that. But I'll tell you what makes an African. An African is made of their cultural views and values. That is the part of the African that you can never really take out of the African. So we wear our clothes and we wear all of these things, but they're just superficial. And if you read the book Target Africa, you would find that I talk a lot about our customs, our culture, when a marriage which occurs, what happens during a traditional marriage in Igbo land, where I come from, and why it is those male-female complementarity. Yeah, they call us homophobic, but I would say that we are going back hundreds of years, within our culture, within our custom, within our own understanding of what, sexuality between a man and a woman means, and what that joining means and portends for the entire society or for the entire culture. So these are things that they have to know about the Africans, but they're still not getting it.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, because some of the most insightful passages in Target Africa are about language.
Yes.
So you mentioned, for instance, the language around marriage and around family, which is the primary target of cultural Marxism and leftism in the U.S. Inborn in your native language that you spoke growing up is stuff that would have to be annihilated to make way for progressive policies. You cannot... They can't coexist with sexual ideology, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, that's why the Africans should hold firmly onto their language, because within our language has been encoded by our ancestors the things to guide us for generations to come, right? So we are absorbing everything good that is coming in the world now, the education. We love all of that. I love it that I can speak English to you, but I'm also very grateful for my own mother tongue, the Igbo language that I speak. I still speak to today. I spoke growing up. We will find within that language preserved things like male-female complementarity and how impossible it is that you can separate that and give us like same-sex marriage, for example, because within our culture, even just the way we say sex, when you talk about sexual intimacy, if you translate it into my language, the only way it comes out is the relationship between man and woman. I mean, there is no other way. It said meko nwoke na nwaanyị. There is no other way of shifting it to mean something else, kind of, as English is now being twisted and reshaped and reformed so that it can absorb all the new things that the sexual revolution is bringing to us. The same thing with abortion as well. How we talk about abortion is such a way that it can never really be made neutral or even good. How now we're hearing more and more things like abortion is healthcare. We heard that this weekend from people like, I think, Senator Kamala Harris. We've heard it from Planned Parenthood. They're trying to bring in other parts of language that will make abortion seem nice or seem good or positive. In the Igbo language, it's impossible, and most of the African languages are like that as well. It's impossible. Abortion always comes up as an abomination.
Right, yeah. Well, it's so funny to me because also, if Western kooky progressivism is foreign to African nations, what's embarrassing about you, Uju, is that you show really loud and clear that African culture is foreign to the BBC, for example. Last year, you did an interview with a BBC anchor.
Hundreds of millions of women do not have access to contraception. The fact remains that hundreds of millions of women don't have access and should.
You're saying should, but who are you to decide, if you don't mind me saying?
Well,
because the thing is, there isn't a popular demand, ma'am. There isn't a popular demand.
But it's a basic human right to have access to it. It is part of that cycle of poverty. And dealing with poverty and overcoming poverty, is it not?
Well, that's kind of a Western solution, isn't it?
If they have access to contraception, if they can deal with birth control, if they can have a family planning program in place, then it deals with the issues of poverty as well.
That is the Western solution. Why don't you listen to the people first?
It's about education as well, so that they understand their basic human rights. It's not just about the West coming and imposing something.
These are colonial thoughts, so you better be careful expressing them. According to whom?
You're then also generalizing, speaking on behalf of, every woman on the continent, saying that the majority of them...
So are you? You're talking about a general solution when Africa is actually not a monolithic society.
All I'm saying is that they should have the right to have access. The United Nations says that more than 200 million women don't have access to it.
But how many of those 200 million women are actually asking for it?
Perhaps they're unaware.
Well, it's for someone like yourself, someone so kind and generous from the West to come tell them that what they need is contraception to come out of poverty. Now you give them contraception, and the next day they still don't have work. The following year they still don't have work.
Obianuju, I would really love to discuss this further with you. We're just 10 seconds to go off air, so thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Do stay with us. We've got lots more coming.
She was like, you are gross. What is wrong with you? She treated you as so foreign. She was so disdainful. She was so flabbergasted. She was like, you are, I mean, it reminded me of late 19th century folks talking about savages, which you talk about in your book. Like, what is wrong with you? Who are you? Well, she's just a Nigerian. That's what.
And I'm just an ordinary Nigerian. Trust me, I am not even, like you say, conservative. No, well, I'm just the regular mainstream Nigerian, right? What I'd say is not going to be much different from what any other person would say. So, but people don't hear us, but I thank God now that something like, the Black Panther has come in. So at least there's some interest. There is some innocent interest in the African culture and custom. But what I would beg is that people go a little bit deeper than the nice clothes and the Wakanda clothes and the Wakanda salute, to come down to it, to get the culture and customs that make up the African people.
Yeah, and they can learn those from you.
That make us very strong. Yeah.
Well, okay, so one last thought I really wanted to insist on discussing, because this is something I came across in my research on the persecution of Christians in the Middle East.
Right.
There is online, you can find it, from the UN, an analysis framework regarding genocide. Now, first of all, the legal definition of genocide: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. It lists a bunch of actions. One of them is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Another element here is that under the section about establishing the intent, so evidence of intent to destroy in whole or in part, etc., one of the things listed is the destruction of or attacks on cultural and religious property and symbols of the targeted group that may be designed to annihilate the historic presence of the group. Now, that reminds me of what you said about language. In your native language, you could say those words are symbols, and they really do have to be annihilated to make way for the cultural acceptance of some of these things. There's something really insidious going on here. I wouldn't say that there's a genocide happening in Africa necessarily, but they're certainly laying the groundwork for it under the definitions provided by the UN itself in 1948. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I would say there isn't a genocide yet, okay? And the watchword being yet, because there is something going on, as you point out, and they are heading towards it. If they are plowing in as much as $9 billion a year for what they call population programs into African nations, for us to cover things like condoms, contraception, and even abortion, comprehensive sexuality education, which of course is trying to gear and prepare the African children for the new version of sexual revolution that has already happened in the West. They're trying to kick it off starting from our children by trying to bring in comprehensive sexuality education into African schools. So I do believe, along the lines of what you are saying, that there is something going on. They are heading towards it. They are fighting Africans in so many ways without the Africans themselves sometimes realizing it is quite insidious. They're going after things like our values. They're defining rights in such a way that if we think about it as Africans, if we lay out our language and put it side by side by the definition of rights that has been made by Western nations at places like the United Nations, you would find out that they are trying to either eclipse what we already know through our language. They are trying to clean it off and delete in many ways some parts of our language and some parts of our culture. They're trying to get us to submit completely to their own definitions of everything. They've redefined marriage. So now it's for us to submit to their definition of marriage. They're trying to define right to life means they're trying to get us to see it this other way, irrespective of the fact, or regardless of the fact that we come from this, we have our own heritage and things that in fact are diametrically opposed to what is being set up in the West. So it's a kind of a deletion. It's a kind of a removal or erasure, if you like, of what already exists among African countries or among African customs. And of course, yes, in the way that they're pushing now population control through really sugar-coated projects and airbrushed schemes coming from really beautiful people like the Gates Foundation, right? The way they're pushing all of these things in, it's such that the Africans sometimes, again, don't realize it, but if you stand back and take a look at the bigger picture, you would find that indeed they are trying to wage war against the fertility of the African woman. And they are trying to stop us from having children at all costs. And yet they're telling us it's for our own good, and they're telling us that people are asking for it. Why don't they go and take several polls across the different African countries to know what people actually think about contraception, or how important, for example, contraception would be when you're asking African women what is important to them or what is important in their lives.
That's right. And you've touched on a lot of elements just there that are in this book that we don't have time to get to. We cannot, in this interview, adequately recommend this book. It is to be recommended more highly than I'm capable of recommending in an interview. But it is very, very good, Uju. I'm really just stunned by it. I think that also it has incredible implications that will ripple out and wake up a lot of people who realize, I have equal human dignity to these Africans, and I should stand up for my cultural beliefs and my roots.
Very good, very good.
In the U.S., we're under attack in a similar way. Not exactly the same, but we shouldn't be apologizing. We should be as unapologetic as you are, Uju, and I think I'm glad you're leading the way in a very powerful way.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I'm so glad that we could talk about this today.
Yes, thank you for coming on the show. And come on again. Let's talk regularly.
Most certainly.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Uju.